good morning here. It's 10:30 in the morning, Dallas, Texas. I'll be one of your speakers, Jeff Bankard. I'm going to turn it over and let Adam introduce himself.
I'm Adam Perella, my Oswego Soli. I am a technical director at Shuman, and I do everything from PCI to training services, and I'm heavily involved in things like digital trust and artificial intelligence.
Awesome. So I'm Jeff Bankard. I'm the Chief Operations Officer here at White Glove AI. The background behind me and my responsibilities range from making sure things run smoothly for delivery of clients or doing everything from ISO 42001 implementation for clients who want to build out their AI management system. Today, we're going to go through some slides and talk about ISO IEC 42001 compliance and the key considerations for US businesses. So let's dive into it. So I've listed out 7 key things that I think are the key considerations for US businesses. And before we even dive into those, I just encourage everyone to go out and try to get their hands on a copy of ISO 42001 and start to familiarize yourself with what's in there. If you've done anything with ISO 27001, the ISMS controls, then ISO 42001 is going to look really similar. So familiarize yourself is the first step, and then getting into these key considerations. So, all right. So for the first one was alignment with existing regulations. So U.S. businesses really should evaluate how ISO 42001 aligns with existing domestic AI regulations and guidelines. Consider how the standard complements initiatives like the National AI Initiative Act and the proposed Algorithmic Accountability Act. And then assess the compatibility with state-level AI regulations. They've got a few of those in California or Illinois. Adam, you have anything to kind of add about the alignment with existing regulations?
I do. To begin, the ISO 42001 does align very well with the other ISO standards, and it makes a big push for organizations to look at the data that they have and understand the regulations that apply to that data, be it PII, privacy, or other, and then using those controls to help guide the actions that are being taken with the management of that data, the securing of that data to prevent inadvertent disclosure, only allowing access to authorized parties. But it's very much a kind of standard that you bolt on to facilitate the existing data regulations and requirements that your organization needs to follow.
All right. So here, step 2 is integration with existing management systems. We talked a little bit about 27001 or ISO 9001 for quality. And this is really where you get, if you're a medium to large size organization, most likely you've got some type of governance, some GRC function, governance, risk, and compliance function. So again, like what Adam said, ISO 42001 is a great complement. A lot of the way that it's set up is going to seem familiar, but you want to make sure you have an integrated approach. And one way you can integrate it is by targeting or nominating somebody that's going to head up the AI management system build out. Someone who can answer questions about where should we have AI, where shouldn't we have AI, how does it complement our existing security controls and things like that. So integrating with existing management systems is another key consideration. Any additional thoughts on this one?
No, I think this was pretty straightforward.
Agreed.
I think we're good on this one.
All right. So let's talk about resource allocation. When you're implementing this standard, you're going to have some dedicated resources. I talked about dedicating sort of a point of contact. We call them a chief AI officer, and that can be a full-time or a fractional chief AI officer. You want to address the need for additional personnel with AI expertise, and that chief AI officer should come equipped with some AI expertise. You've also got to consider some financial investments that are going to be required for training, technology upgrades, and potential certification costs. Have you any experience, Adam, in your organization or maybe in your, in your sister organizations for resource allocation?
We do not provide that, but we definitely see organizations doing that where they don't have the expertise in-house and they need to get things up and running either in the short term to meet an objective or obviously for long-term initiatives. But the resource allocation is definitely a key difference or something that organizations really need to be thinking about, because when we talk about alignment, 27,001, 9,001, 42,001, a lot of these things are similar in how they, A meets B, B meets A. The additional considerations around training, understanding data, and how your organization is applying controls to these data sets to meet secure practices around AI functionality, in-house, external, third party, more likely the combination of these is definitely not, it goes beyond what you would see in the other ISO standards. And to this end, I think it's really important that, to what you were saying earlier, Jeffrey, is that organizations take time to look at this and say, what do we need to train on? What do we need to understand? And then how do we allot the time accordingly? Because, as security professionals, we're always on the preparation side of things.
I love how you hit on time. That's one of the resources that's not listed here, but it's going to take time. That's why I alluded to starting to get familiarized with ISO 42001 as soon as you can, because the sooner you read it, understand the scope and how you're going to develop your controls, it's going to take time. And that's a resource that you've got to plan for sure. All right, so the fourth thing we'll talk about is the risk assessment and mitigation. So obviously, U.S. businesses should conduct thorough risk assessments, identify potential legal, ethical, reputational risk associated with AI use, and then develop strategies to mitigate the risks in line with ISO 42001. And before I hand it over in this point, Adam, I just want to talk about when it talks about identifying potential legal, ethical, and reputational risks. When you're developing these ISO standards, no matter what it is, you're really building them out specific to your organization. So you've got to know those legal risks, ethical concerns, and reputational risks that your organization faces. The better you know your organization, the more thoroughly you can build out those controls and have all the data you need. We're not auditing against 42001 right now, but I predict in the future we will be, and we'll have to produce all the same types of documentation, screenshots, logs, things that we have to for the ISO 27001 controls. And so doing a risk assessment is very important. I'll hand it over to you.
And this element cannot be understated. I think Jeff did a really good job of highlighting all of those aspects. Conventionally, when we think about data, how it flows through an environment, in transit, in storage, what's accessing it, what is maybe parsing elements of it. These concepts, it's not a one-to-one with AI, but these things must be considered. Because the standard does call out not just what can access that data, but concerns around bias, making sure that you're monitoring the engines itself to say, we're getting what we expect out of this. This is functioning as anticipated, so that it doesn't provide information it shouldn't, so it's not handling data in a manner it shouldn't. It's a lot to think about, to put it mildly. So if, as your organization may have historically gone through a risk assessment, I implore all of you to take a very new approach to this and say, okay, what are we doing? How are we handling it? And then by looking at 42001, how are we going to check all of these boxes? And maybe your existing risk assessment processes will help meet that. If so, fantastic. If not, okay, what do we do that's functional? Because the routine monitoring continuance of these actions is required. And it's, for an organization that's doing this the first time, that can be daunting.
Absolutely right. Whenever I'm with a client that's thinking about adopting AI, one of the things we always recommend is adopt AI in a very non-risky part of your business, right? You don't want it implementing AI someplace where there's a high risk of fallout, right? Reputational damage, revenue damage. And so once you get your hands and your arms around that, you can start to document exactly how your data flows through AI, like you stated, and it's always best to start with the least risky area of your business, and then kind of move it or adopt it through your organization that way. All right. So for step 5, stakeholder engagement. This is another area where it's crucial that you involve your employees, your customers, your partners in the implementation process. Start to think about how it's going to impact all of them. So as you consider adopting ISO 42001 and building out your controls, how is it going to impact your relationships with suppliers, with clients, those types of things, with your employees? So stakeholder engagement is a key component of the thought process behind adopting AI and building out your ISO 42001 controls.
I love the term stakeholders here. It's a good move away from maybe more antiquated terms. We see a lot of software security standards starting to use the term stakeholders because software can do anything similar. You can use AI to meet any number of objectives. So the stakeholders here are pretty much anybody involved in this operation, and then understanding what those stakeholders do, how they interact with that data set, and making sure that you're engaging them to not only solicit feedback as needed, but you can also provide training, exposure. It's I wouldn't say that this is anything onerous, but I want to make sure that people understand that this is very comprehensive. Like the term stakeholders is very inclusive of anybody who's going to be interacting with these AI models.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And I think the list is longer than people initially think, right? You walk into developing the controls, you think, oh, it's only these 3 or 5 people or entities. And then you get really thinking about it, digging down, asking your coworkers or other leadership, your list gets longer and longer and longer of stakeholders that are going to be impacted. So I think it's important to take, again, that time to really flesh out all the stakeholders. Couldn't agree more. All right, so from a competitive advantage standpoint, businesses, you need to be thinking about adopting ISO 42001 that can provide a competitive edge, because as we know, it's really hard to have a conversation right now anywhere in the IT space without AI coming up in some form or fashion, right? How we're using it, what's happening, it's everywhere. So most likely your competition is already coming up with some type of an adoption plan. So I put a couple key points on here to assess how early adoption might position your organization as an industry leader in responsible AI, and then consider the potential for improved customer trust and brand reputation.
This is, as an assessment firm, most organizations don't just say, hey, I feel like having somebody assess me. There's a business objective, a compliance, regulatory, legal objective that they're trying to meet. But these can be used, or most often used, as a means to bolster a relationship or create a new avenue of business. And the organizations we're talking to that are initiating this exact standard are looking to do just that. They not only want to say, hey, we are doing what we need to over here, but they want to provide those assurances to their customers and stakeholders, right? We just talked about that. So having this process to say, we know what we're interacting with, and there's a lot of concerns around data that's not new, but the way that these data models are being handled by AI, who can access it, and then again, all of the monitoring, the continuing actions of an organization implementing these models is really, really critical, because this is where you can say to your customers, this is what we're doing. This is how we do it. Here's how we work together. And those assurances are going to help organizations set themselves apart.
Agree. I think this is one of those things that can really differentiate a company. There's been some, posts put out recently where there's some people that are adopting AI, doing it securely, responsibly, that are taking them to the next level in revenue, productivity. And so I think responsible adoption of AI and building out ISO 42001 controls can really sort of supercharge an organization if it's done right.
Agreed.
All right. All right, so step 7, come to the end of this list. So compliance and auditing. So we need to prepare for ongoing compliance and potential audits. And I put potential audits in here because, again, right now, ISO 42001 is not a standard that you can be certified against currently. It is coming, and then you will be audited against the controls that you've put in place. But a couple key points here: develop robust documentation, document your processes, demonstrate adherence to the controls that you set up. There's a lot of things in ISO 42001 that say shall, what you shall do. Not what you can do, not what you should do, but it uses the word shall. So if it says that, it means you must do it. Consider whether to pursue formal certification and associated requirements as it becomes available and as you get your controls filled out. What's your take on this, Adam?
Well, as an assessor, I love myself some documentation. Kind of the bane of everybody else's existence. Anybody who's ever in the military or worked with the government has heard the phrase, if it's not written, it didn't happen. This is no different.
Yeah.
And just like every other audit assessment or other regulatory legal compliance program you're trying to meet, you have to know what you're doing. You have to have it written down. These are the policies, the procedures you're using, and then making sure that these statements align with the standard. Obviously, when we're talking about these things, this standard is meant to be as broad brush as possible. They're not telling you how you need to do things. They're saying, how do you meet this objective? How do you demonstrate that you are performing these actions to limit exposure, monitor these systems, maintain this, train your staff, perform risk assessment appropriately to be inclusive of all stakeholders. There's a lot, but it's the documentation has got to be there. And if you've ever gone through an assessment, and I imagine a lot of people on here have, it's a lot of demonstrating and repeat. Show me what you say you do, show me how you do it, or tell me how you do it, and then walk me through who does it, making sure you get those interviews and you were able to basically paint the picture of what your organization is routinely doing to keep the data secure, perform these operations correctly.
Yeah, I agree. It takes a special kind of person to be an auditor and to be in compliance, because to me, I love it because I think it can be fun. And here's how I think of it as fun. You are being able to show off all of the hard work that everyone's been doing to set up all of the robust controls, the security controls, the logging, making sure everything's documented. And then when it comes time for an audit, you get to show off all the hard work. And my advice is, if you're, if you have an audit cycle, make sure you're doing internal audits first, it's like a dry run, right? Because you know what the auditor's going to ask. So be looking at it, act as if you're being audited, and tabletop that and go through it, and you will find something that's missing, some documentation, some control that's outdated, and those internal audits can be really valuable in getting you ready for that, for game day, when the external audit comes. So I look at it as a way to show off. I've always had really good success, probably because I've been given really good teams who take their job serious, and they always provide the documentation and what we need to show the auditor. So special type of person, but it can be fun. And that's going through some ISO controls can be tedious at times, but I want you to think of it as you get to be the person on the front lines, really showing off how the company performs that work. Yeah.
Before you move off this slide, I think you hit a lot of key points that I talk about routinely. A lot of people look at an assessor or auditor and they see something adversarial. We are the hurdle to accomplishing a task. We see a lot of environments, a lot of implementations, and it is interesting. The benefit of my job is I get to see a very large breadth of environments and help organizations say, this is how we demonstrate this, and that is to what you're saying, Jeff, and where your expertise, your experiences are invaluable to any kind of customer. Where you can develop a relationship with a assessor, anybody in this space, I implore you to find that person, build that trust, engage them and say, hey, this is what we're doing over here. Will this meet this? Will this do this thing? Because there's no reason why these have to be any kind of surprise. These should all be very understandable, useful, and functional, because any of the things that organizations sometimes adjust at the end of the line to say, hey, we're doing this thing, but it hasn't been practiced so much. That's where the friction points happen with your stakeholders, your staff, the people who are doing these things. And these processes, the security considerations must be functional. So involving those staff, talking with an assessor and saying, what are you seeing? How are you doing this? Or does what we do fit the bill? And if not, what do we need to shore up so that when your organization is demonstrating these things, it's more of a, hey, this is how we're doing our job. Check it out. We demonstrate it. Now we're rocking the show, and we're able to highlight those actions instead of trying to make it a series of fixed actions.
I agree. And one thing I will say before we move off the slide too is when you're going through those dry runs and trying to fill out your controls, there's going to be times where you're allowed to say not applicable, like NA for my organization. I would just guard against trying to be too quick with that. Sometimes you have to really be certain that it doesn't apply before you just say, NA. So yeah, that's because they're going to know that the auditor will know if it applies or doesn't. Just putting not applicable is not going to get you out of the responsibility of having to build it out if it is in fact applicable. So
yeah, and I just want to highlight the importance of that statement, Jeff, is that if we do put anything as NA, we don't just get to say, hey, not applicable. Like, we have to explain why it doesn't apply.
Right. So the next section, what I wanted to go through was just a little bit about, how does ISO 42001 address AI risk? And there's three things that we'll touch on. One is an AI risk assessment. Next is an AI impact assessment, and then mitigation strategies that you can use. And as a matter of fact, I'm going to let you take this first slide on the AI risk.
So earlier at the very beginning of this, I talked about data, and this is paramount. What data are you handling? What are the regulations, restrictions, requirements, fill in the blank over that data? And some of these, some of these can be comparatively benign. The second part of this is that it's not a one size fits all. Not everything is super sensitive. So understanding the sensitivity of that data, and then not only that, but like, where does this data reside? What laws apply? Because what is valuable over here, let's say in Europe, may have less sensitivity in the United States. So understanding what you're doing and then saying, okay, based on how we are interacting with this data to yield an output, how is our AI taking this and providing an output that's useful? Is there a risk? And often people are like, oh, well, it's AI, and their experiences with interacting with a chatbot is that you get some bad information, and that's not really a risk. But when we think about what companies, enterprise or newer ones, are coming up with and how they're using AI, there are some pretty significant risks. And this ranges from something as that you probably all benefit from, even if you don't recognize it, are fraud prevention techniques for e-commerce transactions. AI is leveraging a judgment there. And these, one second, I'm in a quiet room. Apologies. I am at the community meeting in Boston, and I had to find a place to set this up. But the data that you're interacting with can provide bad output, which means that in a very comparatively benign aspect, transactions that should proceed are denied. But then we've got bigger things, and there's a great example here with United Healthcare, where they started looking at their patients. They're saying, what are we doing with this data, and how can we auto approve or deny requests? And a very significant number of patients, people who needed medical care, were having attributes misaligned, where this very clearly was not met. So that understanding how this can impact the stakeholders, your customers, and even their customers needs to be a consideration. And then moving on to number two, the risk assessment process, being able to say, based on what we know this can do, how are we performing a routine, ongoing series of operations to mitigate those risks as best as possible? How are we making sure that our AI model is operating appropriately? You know, we hear terms like hallucinations, but this is any kind of operation where it doesn't perform as expected. And these controls can exist, they can be built in, they should be built in. And what your organization is doing to perform that. And then last, you've got all data has a life cycle. You know, our hardware has a life cycle. You get it, it's got an end of life time frame, end of support. AI is not really different because the technology is going to change. The large language models you might be using to achieve an output are going to adapt. Your organization doesn't set and forget. You're going to be maintaining this. And at some point, what you're doing is going to shift enough that you are going to retire something from before, which is good, right? This is the growth of any service. And your understanding of this needs to be defined so that your risk assessments can say, this is how we were doing it. These are the things that was problematic before, and here's the new and improved. But as with anything, your risk assessment needs to be comprehensive of all of that. So it's a lot, but I think it makes a lot of sense when you start to see it in action.
Yeah, I agree. And, I want to hit on just, point number 3, where it talks about the entire life cycle. As you start to think about AI adoption, it really is right from there that you should be documenting everything that you're doing, right? If you're doing proof of concepts, you're doing POCs, maybe it's not implemented, but you're testing, that needs to be documented. Everything that you're doing around AI should be documented and assessed from a risk perspective. As you start to design how you're going to implement, and all the way through to decommissioning, like Adam said, it needs to be documented because we're assessing risk. We're making sure that we've got the right guardrails in place, the security guardrails from how it's prompted to making sure that it's not, our data is not being fed out to like an open model, like a public model to be trained with using the data. So from a risk perspective, you're doing the entire life cycle, documenting it so we can look back and say, these are the controls we put in place, this is how we tested, this is what we tested, this is how we implemented, and then all the way to decommissioning. It's important to be assessing from a risk perspective. All right, so here's the second one. We've got the AI impact assessment. So ISO 42001 emphasizes evaluating the consequences of AI on individuals and societies. And that's a heavy lift, right? You've got to at least sit down with stakeholders and start to have a conversation and start to conceptualize what that looks like on individuals and societies. You have to perform an AI impact assessment to understand broader consequences of the AI deployment, what it's going to be on individuals and communities. And that's a heavy lift because some of it's unknown, right? Some of it we can try to predict to a degree what's going to happen, but some of it are just best guess based on things that have already happened where AI has been deployed in other areas or other organizations or other types of technology and what consequences it's had. So some of it is a guess. And step 2, the standard requires organizations to test the impact of their AI systems on specific target audiences, maybe a subset of the organization. A lot of times when we're talking to client, they have groups sort of already pre-selected that say, these 20 users or these 50 users, depending on the size of the organization, they're the target audience we'd like to deploy a certain type of, AI chat feature or whatever it may be, and that's going to be the proof of concept. And then they're going to analyze, do an impact assessment. How does it impact their work? How does it impact their outlook on the organization? Those types of things. And then step 3, the impact assessment should consider ethical implications and potential societal effects. We do a lot of testing, making sure that whatever you're asking of the AI interface, it's sticking to corporate or organizational answers. It's not letting you go off and ask unethical things, right? Dangerous things, those type of things. So Adam, I'll let you talk about AI impact.
I think you really hit all the salient points here. I would just want to stress that there's a lot of unknowns here. It's, I mean, if you were to sit and anybody who's ever taken a college course on ethics, right, realizes that there's not a, hey, I got this one size fits all thing. Countries argue ethics all the time. So where it's talking about AI and the impacts to society, understanding what you're doing with data, how you're handling it, how your customers are using this, that's where you start. But I want to stress that this is a dynamic, ongoing process, because you can't, each of your organizations would be remiss to assume that, hey, what we're doing today is going to be the same thing we need to be looking at in 6 months. And in interacting with your stakeholders, hearing that feedback, understanding that things may not be operating as you had hoped, is doing, you want to provide this service and you can operate your AI accordingly. But I just want to stress that this is hard and it's not a easy thing to define.
Yeah, I agree. I know that it does change over time. There's some folks, when we roll out AI, they're very leery, I guess is the best term. They don't really want to implement it into their day-to-day workload. And then over time, you're right, it can change. So it's iterative. You have to continue to ask, and it may change. Your selected target group that you're sort of testing on or looking at the impact, it may change after 2 weeks or 30 days or so on. So I think an iterative approach, continue to monitor, ask questions, figure out what the implications are to your organization. That's really going to help you build out that comprehensive AI impact assessment for your organization. And I think Adam and I have said some things, they're a little repetitive, but really these are your controls, right? They're yours. You're building them out. You're building the standard. It's your knowledge of your people. Again, location plays a part, like what part of the world you work in, what vertical, like what does your organization do? It's going to kind of depend on how well or maybe not so well that AI is adopted. But I think by and large, it is a force multiplier. It can be used for good and to help people come to answers a little bit faster, make their work. And again, I use the term fun, but it can be fun when you start to find creative ways to get your work done. So,
agree. If you don't mind, hold on. When
sure.
we talked earlier about test cases, understanding that is dynamic too, right? So if anybody who's baked a number of cookies before, right? You put in that first sheet and you're like, hey, this thing's awesome. You got the second sheet, you got the third sheet. Well, sometimes your temperature time changes as you go along. The oven gets hotter, whatever other controls you got going on. Maybe the dough is sitting longer. So the way that you behaved before is not the same way you're going to be behaving next time. And these kinds of interactions, understanding your data, understanding your model, what you expect it to do, and then how you substantiate that it's going to be operating effectively and not performing biased, untoward, unsafe output is going to change too.
Agreed. It does change over time, and it's important to keep watching what those outputs look like. One thing I will say here is that specifically at Wycliffe AI, we always say that the cleaner your data that you feed the models, the better the output. You want a good, clean data cycle, and if you have a bad one, you talked about changes in temperature, changes in time. If you've got bad data feeding into your models, a lot of times it will, for lack of a better term, gunk up your model, and you'll get what's called data chaos, and your outputs will change over time, and you don't want that. You want it to be stable, you want it to be precise, and good, clean data is a fundamental requirement for good, clean output. All right. So some mitigation strategies. So based on the risk and impact assessments, ISO 42001 requires organizations to develop and implement strategies to mitigate identified risks and minimize negative impacts, establish mechanisms for ongoing monitoring and analysis of AI system security and impacts, and then continuously improve AI systems based on assessment findings. And I just want to say before we dive into this and kind of talk about these 3 points, I am seeing your questions in the chat, And at the end of this, we will get to those questions and try to field as many of them as we can. All right, let's talk about these three sort of points here on this slide.
So I'll take the first one. When we think about risk, it's dynamic to the data, the way it's interacted with. These kinds of concepts are pretty straightforward. And then your organization says, okay, well, how am I using this? What's interacting with it? Because the company that, say, makes an AI model, which is going to do predictive analysis on the way the packages move across the country to estimate timeframes, has a really different connotation than an organization that is looking at human behaviors within accounting, traffic patterns even. So where your organization is developing a strategy to say, okay, what data set are we looking at? What's the sensitivity of that data? And then, based on it, not just we've got these privacy considerations for what's interacting with it, what can be exfiltrated from it, but also are the outputs consistent, providing something that's useful, not dangerous, doesn't help anybody break a law. I mean, we all hear about AI being used to create malware, right? To create malicious code. Well, that's obviously not doing anything that ISO would want to see done or that governments ourselves would ever want to see accomplished. However, I personally have submitted code to AI to say, hey, look at this, clean it up. Can it be done better? Yeah, hit and miss, but definitely have learned some things myself with some of the things I've written. But understanding how your organization is going to say, this is what it does, and how do we mitigate the risk? They're not trying to make a guarantee here, but understand that mitigation is a moving goalpost. The attacks change, the vectors change, your data sets change, the offering you have changes, and therefore the way that you mitigate the risks based upon those functions is also going to adjust.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I want to give one example on point one. Let's just say you go to roll out some type of an AI solution in your organization, and you realize after rolling it out that there's a couple users who maybe they have multiple roles in the company, and they handle, let's say, payments, or they handle something accounting wise, and you didn't want AI there, and you identified it in your assessment. You would mitigate those identified risks by maybe removing the capability to use AI for certain users based on their roles. And that's just an example of how, again, you roll out a solution, you're doing an AI assessment, a risk assessment, you say, oh, these folks, they work in an area where it would be risky for them to be using AI to do their job function. Then you mitigate that by saying, okay, we have now removed access, and an auditor would say, okay, can you prove that? What date did you do it? Show me the log saying they're not accessing AI anymore since a certain date, and you would provide that documentation. Thereby, you're minimizing negative impacts by identifying those risks, mitigating the threat. That's just a off-the-cuff example.
I want to jump right on that because that was a great example, and I'm happy you threw that out there. When we think about when you're filling out a website, right? You fill out a form, you got an email address or a phone number. Well, that form number field is only expecting numbers. That makes sense. So you've got an expected input. And if what you can feed AI doesn't hit some expected input, or similarly, if the output doesn't look good, your engine can stop that from being sent out, and it can filter what's coming in. Because to what Jeff was saying earlier, or Jeffrey was stating earlier about clean data, clean outputs, it's really trying to make sure that your organization is filtering and in monitoring these actions so that you can, again, address those risks before they become an exposed problem.
I agree. And one more thing I'll say about, so step two, on point two on this slide, talks about establishing those mechanisms for ongoing monitoring. And my life, primarily in security, has been in the Security Ops Center, where we log and monitor most everything we can. If we had our choice, we would log and monitor everything, and that's why organizations have large volumes of log data. But AI is no different. We've got a log who's accessing it, the times they're accessing it, and things like that. So the more information you can get about ongoing monitoring and analysis of AI systems, the better. So it's going to help you do those security functions better and assess the impacts. And auditors are going to ask, right? Do you know who's logging in? Do you know what time of the day they're logging in? Is that appropriate for their role? Things like that. And so establish those mechanisms for ongoing logging and monitoring. All right. Go ahead.
I don't want to take too much time. So, we think about, when most organizations conventionally think about monitoring, they think about a SIM, right? That's Security Event Information Management, or SOAR, right? For incident response. This is not really different conceptually. The implementation is going to be unique, but I want to make that parallel so that people don't, because it can seem, this is a lot, and I want to make that clear, but I don't want people to feel daunted by it. I wanted them to feel kind of compelled, like this is a challenge that is obtainable. This is something we can do.
Yeah. That's all we've got for now, for today. It's been a pleasure being with you, Adam, and talking about all this. And I hope the viewers got a lot out of it. And of course, there'll be a recording of it sent out. And if there's any questions that we missed, we'll get that out to you in email. So I want to say thank you to Adam again, and PECB for hosting us, and very excited to sort of lead the way with the adoption of ISO IEC 42001.
Thank you.
Thanks.